Joining me on the rundown today is the Premier of Saskatchewan, the province in Canada. He is Premier Brad Wall. It's very good to have you talking with us.
It's an honor to be here.
You are here with the premiers of 6 other Canadian provinces to meet with members of President Obama's cabinet and for the first time to meet with members of the U.S. Governors Association to talk about a number of issues, especially energy. Right. What is it about this subject that has the two governors and the two countries coming together for the first time?
I think there's a general understanding that, our economies are so inextricably linked by supply chains, by trade agreements, that the issue of energy and the environment is going to weigh heavily on economic matters on both sides of the border. And because we're so inextricably linked, we need to move forward together, I think is what you'll hear from most premiers and governors. Especially as each national government considers different options, be it some levies with respect to carbon or cap and trade or some of the models that have been proposed. And energy is foundational to our respective economies. It's absolutely essential for continued and sustained growth that we have sustainable and affordable energy for the future. So I think that's why it's going to dominate the agenda.
We are wrestling with this issue right now here in the United States about what to do about climate change, what to do about carbon emissions. Why is this of such importance to your country, to Canada?
Well, you're not alone. America's certainly not alone. Canada's going through a similar debate. We have something else in common. We have disparate interests in our respective federations. We have places like Saskatchewan, my home in Canada, that's heavily dependent on coal. 50% of our energy in our province comes from coal-generated facilities. We have other provinces that have more of a mix of hydro. And that's the same challenge in the United States. So, I think that's another reason why we should be looking at the issue together. The debate is very important. We all want to move towards more sustainable energy, but it's the position certainly of our province, and I would expect a lot of other leaders of the subnationals of states and provinces that as we move towards a more environmentally sustainable energy profile, that we don't do so in a way that's unnecessarily hurtful to our economy, that could potentially unnecessarily hurt job creation.
What do you say to Americans who may be thinking, well, this is interesting, but why do we really need to pay attention to what Canada thinks about what our policy is?
I think for the same reason. 36 of the continental states have Canada as their #1 export market, and we are a growing export market for the U.S. Our relationship, our trade relationship, is growing. The U.S. administration has said it would like to see exports from the U.S. double in the next 5 years. By definition, that means more trade with Canada, and so I think it's in the interest of all of us to be moving forward together, because certainly what's good for the business climate in the United States and the trading relationship, it will be good for Canada and vice versa.
I think you would argue that your province of Saskatchewan has done groundbreaking work on carbon capture and storage or sequestration. Why is that something the United States should be paying close attention to?
It's part of the solution here. We know that renewables are part of the mix, and continuing to reduce the carbon footprint on other hydrocarbon production, that's part of the mix. But carbon capture and sequestration works. It's working in our province successfully. We're seeing the storage of CO2 in a stable fashion. It's proven technology, and it's a chance to perhaps ensure that we keep coal in the mix, which at least as a transitional source of energy has to be there. And so there are many in this country, including Senator Graham, who are advocating, including the administration.
Lindsey Graham of South Carolina.
Absolutely, and including the president, who had ensured that there was some CCS, carbon capture and sequestration funding in the stimulus package. It's part of the answer here, and we're very much interested in working with the U.S. in terms of clean coal technologies.
Does Canada now place limits on the use of carbon, have a tax on carbon?
You'll find a different situation in different provinces. In one province, the one next to us in Alberta, they've actually assessed a levy against high emitters and priced carbon at about $15 a ton. They've created a technology fund, though, that companies who are emitters can actually fund new technologies and work to reducing their carbon footprints. BC has a carbon tax, British Columbia, where the Olympics, of course, have occurred. And it's not true right across the country. So each province is looking at a different regime. Saskatchewan will choose what we call a tech fund approach, where we have levies for those who emit, but the levies stay in our province. And again, companies can apply to that fund that's created, that technology fund, to do something about the problem. If I may, we prefer that over cap and trade, which seems to be to us to be more like a general tax that may fund other government activities, but not get us any closer to the answers around sustainable energy by funding new technologies.
And in fact, I was going to ask you about that, because some would argue that until you give companies an incentive to reduce carbon through something like cap and trade, people aren't going to change, companies aren't going to change.
Well, I think there's merit in the argument, and it's actually why some provinces like ours have a concern about cap and trade, because if the emissions, the levies that are charged to the high emitters are used to go to fund other government activities, other general activities, and are not reinvested in the technology that gets us closer to the answers, then it's not environmental policy, in my view, as much as it is a tax. So that's why you'll find others, including our province, saying, yes, let's have a levy, but let's make sure we reinvest it in the technological solutions to lower the carbon footprint of energy production, make energy more sustainable.
So you don't think the incentive argument works?
Well, it depends what you're using the levies for. If the levies go to fund the general affairs of government, highways and healthcare, that sort of thing, I'm not sure it's as effective as saying the proceeds of crime, the levies for high emitters, that's going to go to the technological solutions that we all want, whether that's carbon capture and sequestration for clean coal or renewables or some other technological improvements we can make to energy development.
There are environmental groups, I'm sure you're familiar, like the Sierra Club, who argue that clean coal, carbon capture and sequestration, carbon capture and storage, is really too small a gesture. They argue this is a global problem, something much more dramatic has to be done than just sending the carbon underground.
The something that's more dramatic, though, is going to have a cost to it. And what will bear the cost is the economies of the respective jurisdictions looking at these policies. Whatever the solution is, we have to be able to afford it. The economies have to be able to function and hopefully thrive as we move out of recession. So my point is carbon capture and sequestration is part of the mix, certainly. Renewables are part of the mix. Conservation is a key part of the mix. But let's not exclude anything, because we also need to make sure we balance the economic needs of our respective countries and the environmental concerns we have.
Two other quick questions. What would it mean to Canada if the U.S. does not do something about the carbon issue in the near term?
Well, I think you'll see individual provinces and our national government moving forward with our agenda. We have legislation in our provincial legislature that will pass this spring that sets targets for emissions. The federal government has introduced their legislation as well, and they're working on regulations. And so I think the preparatory work will happen. It's my view, though, that and again, I'm speaking as Premier of Saskatchewan and not on behalf of all the provinces by any means of the federal government, but it's my view that we need to make sure that we're moving in step with the U.S. for the reasons I mentioned earlier, that we have a cooperative approach, that we don't have two sets of rules on either side of the biggest trading relationship on the planet.
And finally, because you're involved in politics as well as policy, you're familiar with the public opinion polls. How do public attitudes toward these issues, climate change in general, differ in Canada from what you know they are in the United States?
I think they're similar. I think there's, in both countries, a growing awareness that whatever path we choose, there is an impact to the consumer. Something will happen potentially to people's utility bills. Something could happen potentially to the economy. That's why we have to be measured. That's why we can't listen necessarily to groups who say, listen, rule out this one particular solution completely and go for that bold step. There has to be a balanced approach here, because people are starting to do the math, and I don't blame them. I work for the folks in Saskatchewan who want to make sure they have a sustainable energy source, a clean environment. They also have jobs that they want to maintain, and they have bills that they need to pay.
Premier Brad Wall of the province of Saskatchewan, it's very good to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much
for joining us.